North Korea, China, and Russia. The current geopolitical landscape is characterized by the extension of the axis connecting these three nations to Pakistan and Iran. Within China's Belt and Road Initiative, Pakistan has become a pivotal hub for facilitating trade and investment between China and South Asia. Meanwhile, Russia is strategically expanding its presence in Indian Ocean via this route, aiming to enhance its economic and geopolitical influence in the region. The alliance front of former communist bloc actors, dubbed as the authoritarian nexus, is strengthening. At China's recent military parade in Tiananmen Square, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, alongside Russian leader Vladimir Putin and the host Xi Jinping, attracted significant attention from the world. How should the relationship between China and North Korea, once considered strained, be taken? Dr. Oriana Skylar Mastro of Stanford University has stated the bonds between China and Russia, the bond between Russia and North Korea have respectively strengthened. However, she highlights that there remain different stances on regional issues, especially security issues, between China and North Korea, suggesting this as an area of potential leverage for South Korea and South Korea's military partners. The growing military alliance among North Korea, China, and Russia, India is another regional actor strongly opposing this. India, in conjunction with the United States, Japan, and Australia, constitutes the Quad, a strategic alignment that positions itself as an emerging power and security guarantor. It is interesting to note that the relationship between India and Pakistan mirrors the North Korea-South Korea standoff on the Korean Peninsula. Two nuclear-armed states, India and Pakistan, face off in South Asia. What about the two Koreas in East Asia? This is the resonance between India and Pakistan today and the Korean Peninsula in the future. Jagannath Panda, a research fellow at the Institute for the Security and Development Policy in Stockholm, Sweden, cautions that the North Korea, China, Russia, Pakistan nuclear network could potentially destabilize not only East Asia, but also Indo-Pacific regional security simultaneously. Finally, we examine the perspective of Germany in Europe regarding North Korea. Dr. Eric Balbach serves as Korea Foundation Fellow of German Institute for the International and Security Affairs, points out that North Korean involvement in Ukraine-Russian war has great impact on Germany's and Europe's perspective and approach to North Korea. Especially, he points out that Europe, including Germany, has recently expressed skepticism about its long-standing policy of critical engagement with North Korea. He specifically notes that following the Russo-Ukraine war, North Korea has emerged as a direct military threat to European security. Even though Europe and Germany will continue to pursue both sanctions and dialogue to engage with North Korea, they must now seek a new strategy as well. Beyond the Korean Peninsula, within this complex structure extending to North Korea, China, Pakistan, India, Europe, North Korea is no longer merely a problem in Northeast Asia, but has become or emerged as a significant variable in global security order. The two Koreas lies at its very center of global security structure in flux. Okay, today we invited world-renowned scholar and policy analyst, Dr. Jagannath Panda of Institute of Security and Developmental Policy. The floor is all yours.
Professor Pehek, good morning from Stockholm, and glad to be here in your podcast. And I also thank your excellent team, Ms. Zoe, and others for arranging this. Great pleasure to talk to you. Let me share with you my brief ideas. And, this is a topic that is not really very often discussed in the Asian or in the Indo-Pacific context, but I'm sure lot from South Korea, from Korean Peninsula, from East Asia, and from the wider Indo-Pacific region. They want to know how does really India look at North Korea, and how does really India look at the Korean Peninsula per se. And I think in my talk, I'm going to share some of my views and perspective on these issues. I think one of the fundamental issue that comes to many analysts and scholars' mind to understand that how does really India look at DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea. I think in order to understand the dynamics between India and DPRK, we need to go back to a little bit history. I think India was one of the first non-communist countries to recognize the DPRK in 1973. And what we should also keep it in mind, that that's the period when India was actually fighting a lot of war with Pakistan, and also just overcome from the difficulty of facing a war with China in 1962. And that is the period in early 70s when there was a lot of geopolitical shifts was undergoing. But India was the first non-communist country to recognize the DPRK, its establishment, and also, despite of all of these geopolitical complexities that India was facing from Pakistan and China during those years, India decided to maintain diplomatic ties rooted in non-alignment principle, which has been the backbone of Indian foreign policy, and respect for sovereignty. Since then, if you see, India has certainly maintained a cordial relations with North Korea. And today, there is an Indian embassy continues to operate in Pyongyang, in North Korea. And that itself explains that how India perceives North Korea, do not want to really cut down the diplomatic ties with North Korea despite of all the sanctions North Korea faces due to its nuclear test and nuclear technologies. India still maintains a cordial and a dialogue-prone cordial behavior towards North Korea. Now here the question comes, what about the bilateral engagement between India and DPRK? Well, if we talk about the bilateral engagement between India and North Korea, I think the bilateral ties have focused mainly on humanitarian assistance rather than strategic alignments. So providing humanitarian assistance to North Korea has been one of the backbone of India's engagement with the DPRK. India has in fact provided food and medical aid, through different UN programs, particularly through the UN World Food Program. Of course, the trade contacts between India and North Korea has been quite minimal, and that's the case with most of the countries in the world, except probably China and North Korea, as you correctly understand. But I think India has not really, seen North Korea so adversely, except on a few issues. Even though the trade has been minimal and halted entirely after the UN sanctions post 2017, but still India maintained limited engagement, keeping the regional communication and dialogue options open with North Korea. Now here, the follow-up question comes, how does really India see, or India does take a position on the DPRK, particularly on so much complex issues such as the nuclear and ballistic missile programs? Well, I think India maintains a very careful positions on North Korea, and also most of these positions drawn on the basis of non-alignment principle. That means we do not really want to condemn North Korea to the extent where the relationship with North Korea or the partner or the future perspective to build a good cordial partnership in the Korean Peninsula will be lost forever. So therefore, if you see India's diplomatic stance on DPRK, India has consistently voices concern over North Korea's nuclear and ballistic missile programs, and that's also especially due to proliferation risk impacting South Korea. While condemning violations of UN resolutions, India avoids confrontational rhetoric, and that's what you could see in India's policy stand or India's position in the UN resolutions. India does not really, express a strong condemnation or doesn't really express its views or stance in such a way which will confront with the DPRK. It supports sanctions. India actually supports sanctions targeting weapons development while safeguarding humanitarian channels. That means India wants to maintain a humanitarian channel of communications with the DPRK, but at the same time, it sanctions weapons, it sanctions and supports UN resolutions, which targets weapon development and proliferation issues, particularly promoting the nuclear weapons. And in fact, if you go into the details, India's concern has been about how North Korea is deeply engaged in the South Asian strategic periphery. As you know, the entire nuclear issues is linked with North Korea's nuclear issues are linked with the Chinese assistance and also backdoor support of Pakistan. As we know, Pakistan through its very well-known scientist, A.Q. Khan, has supported North Korea in terms of providing knowledge and nuclear technological technological knowledge, sharing technological data, nuclear data, how to go for nuclear test. Those has been concerned. So the North Korea, China, and Pakistan link on the nuclear issues has been a concern for India, and India does voices its concern over North Korea's nuclear and ballistic missile program, especially due to proliferation risk impacting the South Asian security environment. Now, here the critical question comes. What is India's position on denuclearization of DPRK? This is a complex issue. As you know, many actually draw a difference between denuclearization of DPRK and denuclearization of Korean Peninsula. From India's point of view, both are very closely linked. But at the same time, India supports complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization of North Korea. At the same time, if you see, India advocates diplomatic engagement over coercion and emphasizes negotiation between DPRK, the US, and many other regional actors. In fact, proliferation risks are viewed as threats to global and regional security as far as India is concerned. So therefore, India's position on denuclearization of DPRK is very, very careful, cautious, but at the same time, India supports a complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization of North Korea. Now, what is India's stance on denuclearization of Korean Peninsula? India actually views India's stance and India's view actually extends peninsula-wide, promoting a nuclear-free Korean Peninsula through mutual security guarantees and phased disarmament. And I think that's the position India takes. India continuously asks that the Korean Peninsula should be nuclear-free through mutual security guarantee, and it should be also going for a disarmament process through a phased manner. And that actually aligns with India's broader global nuclear disarmament principles and Indo-Pacific stability goals. In fact, people might ask that India itself is a nuclear power. And how come India can advocate for a denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula? Actually, the way India is actually asking for a nuclear-free Korean peninsula that is very closely linked with India's broader global nuclear disarmament principles, and bringing peace and stability to the region. India continuously asks that the global nuclear environment should go for disarmament by phase, and it should have followed disarmament principles. And that's how India would actually like to maintain its position as far as the denuclearization of DPRK and denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula are concerned. Now, here one last point before I stop and invite you to pose your comments and questions. One of the critical aspects here is how should we see India's stance on Korean reunification? Because reunification is not a dead subject; it's still very much alive. Many scholars, thinkers, and professors, they do ask about Korean reunification, whether there is a prospects of South Korea, North Korea reunification. Well, India actually understands that the reunification process is a very complex process. It's very similar like India-Pakistan reunification process, which is very closely linked with history. And today, to talk about India-Pakistan reunification to a single nation is very complicated a matter. And I don't think strategically and in real practice, it is possible today, given the kind of foreign policy, given the kind of country Pakistan is emerging as. So therefore, I think the Korean reunification process and the topic is very complex for India, but at the same time, officially and formally, India supports a peaceful Korean-led reunification process without external interference. And I think that's the stance India would like to maintain, that India would like that both the Koreas should take the lead in terms of talking about the reunification process without any external major powers interference. And also, India stresses and emphasizes that self-determination and encourages for a inter-Korean dialogue between the two Koreas. As you could see from the Panjuman Declaration to many other declarations, India has been quite supportive to such declarations, and India talks about inter-Korea dialogue. But at the same time, India refrains from endorsing any specific model, but supports confidence building measures. As you know, confidence building measures has been the backbone of peace and stability between India and China. And if we go back to also history, confidence building exercise was also another important aspect of India-Pakistan dialogue process. So therefore, India has always emphasized on confidence building mechanisms, and therefore, India would not really talk about any specific model of, specific model to be implemented about Korean reunification. Rather, India would support a Korean-led reunification process if it has to happen at any point of history. But at the same time, at this moment, given the complexity of the Korean Peninsula, India would like to see that both North Korea and South Korea continue to exist as it is and maintain a cordial approach towards each other. Now, here actually, a point comes. How does really India maintains its careful strategic balancing between South Korea and North Korea? I think this is a very complex topic, but as far as foreign policy directives is concerned, India might be maintaining a equicordial relation with South Korea and North Korea. But at the same time, when it comes to politics, when it comes to the Korean Peninsula major power politics, India maintains a equidistant relations from South Korea and North Korea and do not want to be a part of the politics in the Korean Peninsula. But at the same time, India today sees South Korea, the Republic of Korea, as one of the critical economic and defense partner. In fact, India's ties with South Korea is progressing day by day on many issues, be it technology, trade, economics, defense sphere. India maintains a healthy and strong strategic partnership with South Korea. But at the same time, India maintains a minimal yet principled ties with the DPRK. That means we do not want to really talk too much about strategic partnership with the DPRK, but we want to talk more about strategic partnership with the ROK, that is the Republic of Korea. So Republic of Korea is a preferred partner for India when it comes to trade, economics, defense, and security and strategic issues. And in between this, strategic balancing, India's goal is to promote stability, actually without isolating North Korea completely, avoiding deeper DPRK dependence on China, because China is a critical actor in the Korean Peninsula, and India do not want that North Korea should be very close to China, as well as to Pakistan and Russia, including Russia. So therefore, India maintains a cordial relations with North Korea and do not want to isolate North Korea completely, and wants to promote stability in the region. Now, here, the big picture. What is India's approach when it comes to act as a responsible regional or global actor? Of course, Korean Peninsula matters to India. India has a active Act East policy. So under the Act East policy, we see both South Korea and North Korea are two important partners and two important countries in the Korean Peninsula. Therefore, India aligns DPRK policy with global non-proliferation commitments through humanitarian aid, dialogue advocacy, and adherence to UN mandates. India positions itself as a balanced and responsible stakeholder in Asian security. At the same time, as I mentioned earlier, South Korea is a critical country to India, and the partnership with South Korea is being given a huge preference in Indian foreign policy. So therefore, when it comes to the partnership with South Korea, India sees South Korea as a critical bilateral partner, as well as a partner in Asia and in the larger Indo-Pacific. As you know, if you see India-South Korea joint statements today, it's not only bilateral centric. It actually talks about so many critical issues, particularly in the Asian context as well as in the wider Indo-Pacific context. There has been few discussion about how India and South Korea should improve the ties in the multilateral forums. So the South Korea ties is critical to India. India sees South Korea as a critical partner in global forums, in many global multilateral forums. So the relationship is improving continuously, and particularly in the area of science and technology, defense, including in semiconductor. South Korea is emerging as a critical partner for India, and India want to capitalize on that. So if I could summarize my perspective, I would say that North Korea's relationship with India is limited, and it is limited and quite marginal in the context of India's non-aligned principle. And India still says that India can implement a principle of strategic autonomy. That means we could still continue to engage with North Korea, but that does not mean the relationship with South Korea is not given preference. In fact, the relationship with South Korea is one of the priorities in recent years in Indian foreign policy, and that's how India positions itself. Looking forward to a very engaging, sustainable, and secure partnership with South Korea, because it's a critical economic actor in the Korean Peninsula. I will stop here and probably invite your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your, comprehensive overview and then evaluation on India's perspectives and approach to the two Koreas, not just in North Korea, but also in South Korea. Yeah, I mean, again, India-South Korea relationship and Republic of Korea relationship has been improving steadily, and not very, quickly. I think this is a pretty important part. But at the same time, India's approach to North Korea it's not, doesn't revolve around the strategic alliance or alignment, but revolves around humanitarian aid. And then he, Dr. Panda compared the India-Pakistan relationship and then South Korea-North Korea relationship. Yeah, I mean, let's start with this. I mean, plenty of questions to ask to you. The Great Divide, yeah, of course, the Pakistan and India and Pakistan, and the South Korea and North Korea. You just briefly mentioned about you don't think in the South, the India and Pakistan won't have any chance, to reunified in the subcontinent, South Asia. I agree with you. I think this is a pretty long shot. I think it's not impossible shot, but it's pretty long shot. But what do you take on the South Korea and North Korea's reunification potentials? I think that's a pretty interesting question to make.
Well, this is a very complex topic, as you know, Professor Paik, and reunification is it's a long-drawn, systematic process that has to be decided between the two Koreas, and that's the principal position India holds. But I don't see that this reunification is happening anytime in future, and this reunification simply cannot happen when there is a major power involvement is there in the Korean Peninsula. We have seen United States of America is a critical actor there. China is a critical actor. In fact, there are also other major actors, including Russia, is involved in the process. So, any kind of unification or reunification we are talking about, as you know, there is a difference between unification and reunification. Probably the process of reunification implies to the undivided Korea. But when we are talking about unification, we are primarily talking about unification under the current context. So how this process actually leads to discussion, dialogues between the two Koreas, and how the world is reacting, particularly the major powers, particularly the United States of America, China, Russia, including, in fact, a country like Japan, how is it really responding, will invariably matter to India, because even though, as I mentioned in my talk, that India do not want to involve itself too much into the Korean Peninsula politics or major power politics in the Korean Peninsula region, but still, India would not really be blind to all of this politics, because India is a critical actor in the Asian geopolitics and in the larger Indo-Pacific politics. India's strategic canvas is expanding. India is a critical partner, a strategic partner to Republic of Korea, South Korea. So I think keeping all of the interest in perspective, India would not really, be blind eye to the reunification process of the major power politics. But at the same time, India do not really see this reunification process happening anytime soon. And primarily it is not happening because probably not the major powers, particularly US and China, they do not want the two Koreas to be united. Because if given a circumstances, both South Korea and North Korea are united, then there will be stronger Korea emerging out of it. And a stronger Korea is not really a good thing to China. A stronger Korea is not good thing to United States of America. So I think a stronger united Korea is not in the interest of major powers like China, Russia, and the United States. And this is where I don't really anticipate and see that the two Koreas are going to be united. And therefore, India would also looking at the developments carefully, but I don't see in any time in future India would anticipate that the two Koreas are going for unification.
Okay, thank you so much. Today we invited the Dr. Eric Balbach from the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. the German Institute of International and Security Affairs. Yeah, we will listen to his briefing on the German perspective on North Korea. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I want to say a few words about my personal motivation on studying Korean Peninsular affairs. This started between 20-25 years ago now, and my motivation in getting into especially also North Korean affairs was basically that 20-25 years ago, when you still had to consult libraries for your research, primarily there was hardly any quality material which I could find, especially in Europe. So it started with this academic fascination of North Korea being not well understood. And then my research, after 12 years working for the Institute of Korean Studies at Freie University Berlin, my research was always very policy oriented. So I moved to the German Institute for International and Security Affairs 7 years ago, where I serve as a Korea Foundation Fellow. So my part of my work then was also in participating in informal dialogues involving high-ranking officials from North Korea, South Korea, and the US, which were previously held in Europe in a couple of cities. So this gave me an additional motivation to keep going with Korean Peninsular affairs, especially as we moved more to the security field of things in Europe as well. So how does Germany engage with North Korea? I want to make the first point, and I think this is very important to understand. If we talk about Germany-North Korea relations, we always have to think about EU-North Korea relations as well, because German foreign policy on the Korean Peninsula, both North and South Korea, is of course always embedded in the broader relations of the EU. With both North and South Korea. So let me first focus on the bilateral track, meaning the immediate bilateral relations between Germany and North Korea. And of course, historically, this started with the GDR's relations to North Korea in Cold War times, which were comparatively close, and we can still see signs of this relationship in North Korea actually today, if we look at issues like the reconstruction of the North Korean town Hamhung, which was done by East Germany. Of course, a particular point in time was the German reunification, and after German reunification, West Germany and East Germany, after they were reunified, Germany started its relationship with North Korea basically in 2001, when, or at least officially, when diplomatic relations were established. But as early as the 1990s, Germany was involved in North Korea, especially through humanitarian assistance initiatives. The broader EU, and I will come back to this in a second, of course, was also active during that time. The issue was that after the so-called second nuclear crisis emerged, Germany and the EU mostly lent political support then to the six-party talk process, while sanctions became an ever more important of the broader political strategy vis-à-vis North Korea. And Germany was one of the driving forces of autonomous EU sanctions against North Korea. A particular important moment then was Germany's publication of the Indo-Pacific strategy in 2020, which showed that Germany was eager to diversify its relationship in the region and play a more active role in the broader Indo-Pacific. Again, we have to see the German policies on the broader Indo-Pacific also in the context of the EU, since Germany's Indo-Pacific strategy was always meant to be a complementary part of a broader EU strategy on the region. So this is why it's very important to understand this distinction, and we will surely come back to the bilateral angle on this as well. If we talk about the broader EU relations on North Korea, we see distinct development phases. In the 1990s, the EU was highly active. We call this period active engagement usually. This was when the EU started not only to provide humanitarian assistance to North Korea, but importantly also got involved in the then process to solve the nuclear issue, namely the establishment of the Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization. So the whole KEDO process, in which the EU became one of the executive members and a particular important funding element of the KEDO project as well. Importantly for the EU, these activities were explicitly designated as a contribution to regional stability, meaning at that time the EU had a broader focus on strategic aspects already when it comes to the Korean Peninsula. And it wanted to play a more active role. And we can see this, of course, also in the context of Kim Dae-jung's then sunshine policies, which were one of the core elements, of course, why the EU also wanted to support this process, inter-Korean process as well, by engaging with North Korea more directly. There was a direct link between then President Kim Dae-jung and then German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, who had many bilateral consultations on this process, and Germany was one of the driving forces that most EU countries then established diplomatic relations to North Korea in the early 2000s. Then, of course, the second nuclear crisis in 2002 emerged, and this was when the EU relations to North Korea started to change from an active engagement approach to a more conditional engagement. While some of the initiatives were halted, humanitarian assistance continued, and the EU had established a political dialogue with North Korea, which also continued during that time. But the more active role of the EU then started to, let's say, become more conditional. And the EU basically focused on supporting the official six-party talks process without playing a direct diplomatic role in this process. And since 2013, we speak of a phase of development between the EU and North Korea, which we often call as active pressure. This was when North Korea started after Kim Jong-un assumed power, when North Korea started to re-engage with missile testing activities, nuclear testing activities. And this had the consequence that the EU focused very much on sanctions as its core strategic principle in dealing with North Korea. It halted the political dialogue. It halted diplomatic initiatives with North Korea, leaving basically only a couple of informal dialogue channels we had with North Korea in Europe, and of course the channels through the embassies. But this channel too then began to fade when North Korea went into a national lockdown in 2020 after the global COVID pandemic emerged, which had the consequence that the European Union member states closed their embassies in Pyongyang. And we see that so far only Sweden and Poland have resumed their diplomatic initiatives in North Korea, their embassies in North Korea, but they are still in a very early stage and haven't fully re-engaged with North Korea so far. So when North Korea then supported Russia's war against the Ukraine, of course, things changed dramatically in both Germany and Europe. We saw a direct result of the overlapping security dynamics in the Indo-Pacific and Europe. And this, of course, brought many European countries, especially after North Korea deployed troops to an active war in Europe. This was when a lot of European countries then, of course, saw North Korea as a much more immediate threat. plans to resume political dialogue between the EU and North Korea have been halted, therefore. And it's a very difficult situation now for Europe, because in the past we played this facilitator role many times, but this has become so difficult now that North Korea is actively involved in a war in Europe. Making it very hard for European countries under current circumstances to re-engage fully with North Korea, to propose a diplomatic initiatives, leaving Europe a little bit on the sidelines of events at the moment, of course. But within the EU, there is, of course, a debate on how to proceed with North Korea, and I'm happy that we can talk about this in the Q&A now as well. I would leave it at that at the moment and look forward for our engagement now.
Okay, thank you for your very, very succinct presentation on the German and the EU relationship between North Korea. Let's start with the sanction. And then during your presentation, you mentioned that Germany and the EU in general, its perspective, it's pretty, changing on North Korea, but at the same time, their perspective on North Korean nuclear graduation issue might not be changed. That's my first question. Is it really changing? Number two is, what about the reliability or effectiveness of a sanction? Does Germany and does the EU think that this sanction on North Korea regarding the nuclear weapons and ballistic missile development is still viable or not?
Let me start with the second question on sanctions. There are different motives and different rationales in a way linked to both UN and EU sanctions against North Korea. And of course, one of the objectives of sanctions was to change North Korean behavior, which ultimately did not happen. But there was always also another aspect to the sanctions, mainly to signal both to North Korea and to other countries that if you go down this route, we will sanction you whether you change your behavior ultimately or not. This is basically the aspect of sanctions which should increase the cost for North Korea to continue down its path, to make it more difficult. I don't think that anyone in Europe actually thinks that these sanctions will directly change North Korean behavior, but they will make it more costly for the North Koreans to further continue down this road. And I think this is what we have to differentiate when we think about the objective of those sanctions. It's also to signal to other countries that if you go down a similar path, of course, this will be both politically but also economically costly to you. So this is one of the aspects. Second aspect we have to mention here is that EU sanctions, of course, mainly consists, or the backbone of EU sanctions, of course, is the UN sanctions regime. But from the beginning, from the early stages in 2006 onwards, the EU sanctions regime actually went further than the UN sanctions, with additional listings of individuals, for example, with a broader sanctions on an earlier sanctions regime on delivering any kinds of weapons or dual-use goods to North Korea. So in the EU, Germany, France, and before Brexit, the UK have been the driving forces behind those sanctions regimes. And I actually don't see an end to it even now, that the main, I would say, driver of sanctions now has moved outside the UN Security Council due to Russia and China basically openly breaking those sanctions resolutions now. And we see a multilateral sanctions team now that cannot, of course, replace what the UN did. But we see this strong effort also by Germany to continue and uphold the sanctions regime. And this is why Germany also deploys annually ships to the Indo-Pacific now, part of their mission is to supervise that these sanctions, that the sanctions regime is implemented. So even though this is just an aspect of it, it became a core element also of Germany's and the EU's North Korea strategy, this whole sanctions issue. To your first question, if behavior actually changed, I would say over time the EU's behavior vis-a-vis North Korea changed quite dramatically from a really active player and providing opportunities for economic and political engagement with North Korea now to a very restrictive behavior, I would say, focused on sanctions first, without any, let's say, diplomatic initiative in the pipeline at the moment. As I mentioned before, it's very difficult for Europe, while North Korea is fighting in an active war in Europe, to start any diplomatic initiatives with North Korea now. But it's a good sign, I think, that first embassies reopened, because we need credible information on North Korea, and ultimately we need to talk to North Korea too when we find the right framework. And maybe at the moment this right framework would primarily be more the unofficial level, so not starting a formal diplomatic initiative with North Korea, but maybe see if there is space for some informal communication channels now.
Okay. And let's talk about a little bit about Germany, and that's the follow-up question. The Russian aggression. Russia doesn't hide its intention to say expand its war, beyond the Ukraine. Not just Moldova, Lithuania and then Poland and other countries feel very threatened, and then Germany is right behind it. Those buffer states is playing a role in the securing German and then French and then Italian or Spanish, the security for a while. But as far as I understand, Germany actually started to de-arm itself, build up its military power all over again. Can you share your ideas, what's really going on in the German defense sector right now?
Yes, after Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, our former German Chancellor Olaf Scholz gave a speech which was widely, of course, acknowledged, because Germany has, due to its past, has been very, let's say, hands-off, had a hands-off approach to our defense industrial base. So the relationship between the government, mainly the Ministry of Defense, and the defense companies in Germany are very different than, say, in the Republic of Korea, where there is a much closer relation between the government and the defense industry. In South Korea, there's what we call an ever-warm production in the defense industry due to the ongoing conflict with North Korea. And in Germany, we had this very much an hands-off approach. And then after Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, the then Chancellor Scholz gave a speech which was entitled as Zeitenwende, so a change of times, basically a transformational change in a way, to the degree that Germany was in a different era, a new geopolitical era, and it had to react to it, meaning it had to rebuild, we have to rebuild our defense industrial base, which in the last decades, basically, since we were living in peace times, and we had not been investing in our defense industrial base as other countries. And this was rightly criticized also by the US in the past, not only by Donald Trump, but by his predecessors as well. And since Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, all of this changed with a huge investment now in rebuilding our defense industrial base. With a more strategic communication between the government and the defense industries, and a more, let's say, a much more visible approach to our own security and defense. Not so much, of course, relying on other countries, even though other countries are inherently important, but also strengthening NATO as a whole. And Germany wants to contribute to the strengthening of NATO by investing massively now in its defense industrial base.
My last question before I let you go. Let's go back to North Korea in the Ukraine. My last question is, how long will North Korean troops stay and fight against Europe and then Ukraine in Russia right now?
That is, of course, a very difficult question to answer. It really depends on the broader developments now of the war. Will we be successful in achieving any kind of at least stopping of the fighting? Will we achieve a peace agreement? This is all very, very far in the future at the moment. But I think North Korea is heavily invested in Russia's war against the Ukraine. And my argument would be that it's not only Putin now who has a direct stake in winning this war. It's also Kim Jong-un by now who invested heavily economically and politically. It was a big risk for him what he did there, and I guess if the price is right and we don't know exactly what the North Koreans actually get from Russia for sending weapons, but also especially for the troop deployments, we are of course not 100% sure what they receive in turn. But if that what they receive from Russia is what they actually need at the moment, either technological know-how, if we think about re-entry technology of ICBMs, if this is what they actually get, I think they are even more invested to continue. So our challenge would be, how can we break up this close relationship between North Korea and Russia, at least once the fighting is over in the Ukraine? Because then, of course, the nature of Russia-North Korea relations will get into a new phase. And then it is, we should ask the question, will it go on? Will this close relationship survive the fighting in the Ukraine? Or will reality be new then for both countries?
Okay, so then according to your logic, and which I agree most, then North Korean troops and North Korean soldiers will be seen in the Europe at least for a while.
And I think so, even if we think about rebuilding efforts now, if Russia is successful in keeping some of the Ukraine's territory after the war ends, then of course it needs to be rebuilt, and North Korea could play the next role there.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much for your excellent the answers to my tricky questions. All right.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Professor Oriana Skylar Mastro, and then she's in Italy, which is beautiful. And floor is all yours.
Thank you for having me. As you mentioned, I'm in Europe right now, and I think it really highlights how connected now Europe is to Asia, and how things that happen on the Korean Peninsula are so important also for obviously South Korea, but the rest of the world. So I have slides here that I can show if you want me to share them. These mainly highlight, go ahead and do that. They mainly highlight recent developments in the relationship between North Korea, China, and Russia. In this context, it's really important to understand some developments that are of great concern and some things that we still have to watch as we move forward. So in recent developments, just to highlight some of the things that have happened, there has been an alignment of these countries, but also a closeness between them that we haven't seen before. And in particular, I would highlight the closeness between China and Russia, and then Russia and North Korea. So it's not a completely symmetric type of triangle. I'll also mention early on that a lot of people also put Iran into this relationship and talk about Iran, North Korea, Russia, and China. But in this context, as a China expert, I will tell you that Iran doesn't really have the same level of strategic alignment with China. And so I prefer to think about it as a triangle instead of an autocratic quad, as some might refer to it as. So between China and North Korea, the relationship, and I've written elsewhere, we have to be honest, this is not a good relationship. The two sides don't like each other. I remember 10 years ago, even more, 20 years ago, when I did my first research project in Beijing about their relationship with North Korea. At that time, a Chinese leader had not met with Kim Jong-un. They used to complain that the North Koreans would test during times that were sensitive to China, but that for strategic importance, mainly that China wanted to ensure a level of influence over events on the Korean Peninsula, they had to maintain the relationship. And so just last month, we saw that there was the anniversary of the signing of their treaty. And in effect, the treaty that China has with North Korea is its only military alliance. China, in the Cold War, signed this agreement, but has since decided that alliances are not the way to organize relationships with countries, and they prefer strategic partnerships. And so the relationship with North Korea is sort of a remnant of that. China continues to have influence over North Korea, in particular economic leverage, as they account for over 98% of the trade that North Korea has. And so just like Russia now, more and more after the war in Ukraine with the sanctions that Russia is facing, Russia is becoming more and more economically reliant on China, and so is North Korea. So it's an interesting alignment dynamic because alliances are usually about military aspects, and we'll get to that in a second. But really for these countries, some aspects of the closeness of these relationships and the ability of these countries to wage wars or to be disruptive forces in the international system are not because China protects them militarily per se, but because China protects them economically. The Chinese do have very strong views about nuclear issues. This has come up in their relationship with the North Koreans and with the Russians. In May, they had a rare nuclear spat over nuclear rhetoric. We know that when the Russians were threatening nuclear use in Ukraine, in dialogues I've had with the Russians and the Chinese, it had been highlighted that China communicated very, very clearly to Russia that their relationship would be over if there was nuclear use. And so China tends sometimes to take a hard line when it comes to nuclear issues, as they have their own, limited retaliatory capability and no first use. So is there an autocratic access? I like to say that a lot of my research, some people think is too hawkish, some people think it's too dovish because it can be somewhat nuanced. These countries have in recent months taken on responsibilities that they've never taken on before, right? Chinese and North Korean troops took part in a military parade in Moscow. We know that North Koreans have been sent to fight on behalf of Russia and Ukraine, which was a first. Russia, meanwhile, has provided significant weapon systems to the DPRK, like fighter jets, surface-to-air missile systems, armored vehicles, missile technology, and food aid. And of course, North Korea also provided some things that Russia needed, like artillery shells, long-range missiles, as one of the main issues for the Russians in Ukraine has been a lack of munitions. But that doesn't necessarily mean that this is an alignment between these countries to the degree that, the United States really, or, allies like South Korea really need to try to push back against, for two reasons. The first is, and I look to the Cold War here, these countries, their alignment with each other did not serve their strategic purposes during the Cold War. If anything, it caused a lot of issues across these countries that made it so they didn't only have to deal with their own strategic issues and threat environments, but that as other countries dealt with them, it impacted them. And in particular, I look at China and what China wants out of this relationship. And it's very clear that the Chinese government does not want to create the impression of a bloc between China, Russia, and North Korea. One, China loses a lot of leverage over the North Koreans as the Russians become closer. In my discussions I've had meetings with PLA officials, with party officials about these issues. And they've said to me, no, they do not like it when the Russians visit North Korea or make these types of arrangements, but there's not a lot that they can really do about it. It also makes them lose leverage over North Korea in particular. They also feel like in a lot of cases, the Russians, by involving the North Koreans, create some instability that might derail Beijing's broader ambitions with respect to Taiwan. In particular, and this goes to some of the questions we might talk about in the Q&A, China it cannot win a war over Taiwan that involves U.S. allies and partners in Asia. And what I mean is direct involvement. Like if Japan were to fight to defend Taiwan, or South Korea were to fight to defend Taiwan, there's no situation under which China could win. And so their strategy is really one in which they're focused on, one, moving quickly enough that they don't really have to engage with the United States. But even if there is military engagement, it does not involve direct engagement with those allies. As North Korea and Russia become closer to China, China is fearful that these countries that tend to be a bit more disruptive in their foreign policies and military policies than China will take certain actions that will cause major changes in Tokyo, in Seoul, and in Europe in particular, to cause a coalition to form such that Europe, NATO starts to see what happens on the Korean Peninsula or over the Taiwan Strait to be vital to their security. And South Koreans start to see Taiwan as vital to their security. And this creates a scenario in which China has a very difficult time winning. So what does this mean for the United States and South Korea? I would argue that this triangle is really unstable and full of contradictions. And so the best thing to do is not threaten one and say, oh, if you're closer, Russia, if you get close to North Korea, you will be punished, or North Korea, if you get closer to China, you'll be punished. But the number one thing that I've seen historically in these alignments that cause a disruption of the alignment are twofold. The first is unmet expectations. And so when these countries want something from the other, they do not get it, the value of the alignment goes down. When the United States or South Korea or others step in with threats, this provides deniability for why certain things were not provided. So I'll provide an example. China would never have sent military personnel to support Russia in the war in Ukraine, and they never would have sent as well clearly, offensive military systems to Russia. The United States, concerned though that this would happen, issued a series of public demands and threats against China, such that when the Chinese were going to fail to support their ally, instead of it being obvious to the Russians that this support was not forthcoming, they were able to blame the United States for it, thereby preventing, perhaps, a wedge from forming. And then the second thing that causes these countries to disintegrate in terms of their relationship historically is not that they have to have different threat perception. So it's a very high standard to say we want to convince Russia that China is more of a threat to them than the United States is, or convince North Korea that the Russians are more of a threat to them than the United States is. That is not necessary. What is necessary is that they have different approaches. So all these countries can continue to agree that the main strategic challenger is the United States. But historically, when they have disagreements over how to handle the United States, and in particular when they feel like their partner's way of doing things creates certain patterns of behavior in the United States and its allies that are bad for them, that's when things tend to fall apart. So we should leverage this. And one of the things that I argue is that China doesn't want to be a part of this bloc. They want all the benefits of the relationship with North Korea and Russia with none of the costs. And so because of that, we should treat them like they are a bloc. We should criticize China when North Korea does something bad, criticize China when Russia does something bad, because this will create that instance in which they start to feel like the alignment is no longer worth it. And of course, we should show that, these threats are, regional, they impact all of us, and continue with some of the major steps that have happened between Japan, South Korea, and U.S. alignment. I will end by saying that I had a very senior party official. I had dinner with a very senior Chinese Communist Party official after I'd published something about these recommendations in Foreign Affairs, and he said he read the article, and I asked him, "Oh, how did you like it?" And he said, "I did not like it." And I said, "What did you not like about it?" Because it argues China doesn't want to be a leader of an autocratic bloc, which I thought he would like because in Washington, that was gaining a lot of traction. And he said, "What I don't like is the idea that we would have to pay the cost of bad Russian or North Korean behavior." So for me, what that shows is that those are viable recommendations. Usually if the Chinese don't like something, it means it's a good idea. And so hopefully that's a little bit of information to help us open up to a greater these issues.
Of course, Chinese care about the grand strategy of the United States, of course, and at the same time, China tried to control many, moving factors and moving parts in here and there. But and then Russia and then North Korea do not listen to China's order. Let's start, from the North Korea's nuclear weapon system, and then there are some conflicting views on this China's position on North Korea's nuclear weapons. And you just made it very clear, and I agree with you that China is not very comfortable with the North Korea's very aggressive first to use type of nuclear weapon strategic tactics. North Korea's nuclear weapon system might be a strategic asset for the China. Of course, you can the pinpoint against the Beijing and Shanghai anytime. It is because North Korea doesn't.
They don't like the idea in the international system that some countries deserve certain things and other countries don't deserve certain things based on whether or not they behave according to kind of Western liberal norms and values. Because of winds and geography and the closeness, there would be nuclear fallout. I've written elsewhere that actually Xi Jinping himself has talked about reunification under a South Korean government. But from the Chinese point of view, why should they pay costs to help the United States? I continue to be convinced that, if it was credible that the US military would leave the Korean Peninsula, if North Korea no longer existed, then China would be much more helpful in dealing with the North Korean issue.
When he told the North Korean ruler that China believes North Korea wants US forces out of South Korea, and then quote unquote, the Kim Jong-un laughed and pounded on the table in the sheer joy, exclaiming that the Chinese were liars and it needs the USFK to protect himself, Kim Jong-un and Jong-un's regime. We know, the Donald Trump administration actually trying to do, global, alignment posture one more time. And that actually, channels the strategic positions of each country to other, directions.
And on one hand, I do not believe the Chinese have sort of traditional territorial ambitions against Korea. On the other, I think the nature of power has changed in recent years, such that the Chinese recognize they don't have to physically occupy territory to control a country. And in that context, it is absolutely the case that China would see a unified Korea as like a Chinese vassal state, in that the Korean government, would still exist in all of its complexities, but Chinese power would impose demands on these governments, whether it's the South Korean government, Australian, what have you, so that the sovereignty of countries would be limited. That is China's view of hegemony in Asia. And so they and the Chinese view is that this sort of instability in Asia is caused by the presence of the United States. And to a degree, they're correct, because their view of instability is that countries are not naturally acquiescing to Chinese power. And of course, if the US military were not present in Korea, for example, then the Korean government would have to make different decisions.
Yeah, I think so. And it's interesting that Donald Trump administration actually give a signal to South Korean government, and then their American ground forces, about 4,500 circulated troops will be removed from Korean Peninsula, and then that actually gave a very bad signal to China and a good signal to North Korea. South Korean strategic community discuss about this very complex situation. those ground forces, 4,500 soldiers, ground forces, and they are the tripwire, for the North Korean potential invasion on South Korea, or South Korea, but it's not harmful to China. But without those 4,500 ground forces, troops, and then entire purpose of American troops on South Korean soil is not heading to North Korea, but heading to China. So this is a very big strategic change in the Korean Peninsula and East Asian security by Donald Trump administration's global posture realignment plan. And then what do you think?
Well, the first thing is until sometimes it's unclear whether or not these movements have already been decided upon and will be executed versus our leverage in broader negotiations. It has been the case for decades now that the United States has requested from the South Korean government strategic flexibility, which means the ability to use the US forces that are based in South Korea in a contingency against China. And that request has been denied over and over and over again, right? So this is less about, is South Korea going to fight China, and more, can the United States use its assets in South Korea directly in an offensive manner against China? So on one hand, I'd be curious if what the Trump administration is trying to do is to get greater flexibility for those US assets on the Korean Peninsula versus really trying to minimize the footprint. The second thing I think that's important is often what is necessary to reassure allies and partners like South Korea is different than what is necessary to deter China. So, theoretically, we think these things should be the same, right? Same with defense. Our ability to defend should increase deterrence. But actually, given geography, given different perceptions, it is not the same. Any sort of conflict over the Korean Peninsula, we know that for the most part, the ground forces come from the South Koreans. And so mostly what it is air power and other assets coming from the United States. But as technology has evolved, at least with China, a lot of that forward presence puts those forces at such a level of vulnerability that they're no longer able to defend. It is the case that I think the United States has wanted more flexibility for their forces and wants the South Korean military finally to take over operational command and other things so that the United States military can focus more on China and rely on our allies and partners to take on other issues.
In the, say, constraining, China. And then let's move on to, Taiwan Strait. That you mentioned that, if there is something happen between China and, Taiwan, China, if we invade and try to take over Taiwan, if South Korea and Japan get involved, and probably Australia partly, involved in this, war in the Taiwan Strait, and China has no chance to win the war. Either China, assist or help China to win over Taiwan. In case.
Well, what I know for certain is that the Chinese do not want the North Koreans or the Russians to take military actions at the same time that they launch a campaign against Taiwan. Because again, that more likely draws in all the other US allies and partners and makes it more difficult for them to achieve their goals. Even though the United States, of course, has difficulty fighting a two-front war. In the end, we would prioritize Taiwan over Ukraine or, probably, it depends, but we would have to prioritize that. The issue, though, from what I hear from the Chinese, is they don't think they can control Kim Jong-un or Putin. So from Kim Jong-un's perspective, I'm not a North Korean expert, but it does seem like when US forces are tied down doing something else, that would be the most opportune time if you're going to do something to do it then. So I think concerns about multiple conflicts at the same time, those are legitimate concerns, but not because the Chinese are deliberately coordinating those attacks among their North Korean and Russian partners.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.